Well done on manning the ship without me last week, Kat.
Okay, I'm struggling out here with these news. I lost my passport. I missed a flight. My account's overdrafted, and I'm eating a ready-made pasta from Lidl for $1.25. That's not demure or mindful.
Well, I still saw you last Sunday, and that was nice. And I'll see you soon, I suppose.
With no flights missing, please, I can't afford it in this economy with the way things are going. Oh, God.
I will be the one taking the flight. It won't be like when you came to Munich. Well, on the subject of Munich, do you want to hear about it?
Oh, dear God, let's start.
Welcome to All Out on the Eastern Front, the podcast where we talk about the most important stories from Eastern Europe and Eurasia each week. And boy, has it been a week, and it looks like it will keep on being a week for the foreseeable future. I'm Charlie Hancock. I'm a journalist at the Moscow Times and writer about European security at Crisis Europa.
And my name is Kat Shinhilia. I'm a master's student at King's College London for War Studies, a wannabe journalist, and someone who is not currently enjoying living through historical events.
She's also sick, which explains why she sounds like a chain smoker.
Oh, following in my family's footsteps. Yay!
Well, usually we bring two stories from across the region to discuss on this podcast. But this week, we're going to do something a little different.
We've decided that considering everything that has occurred for the past week, it's perhaps best to focus on what happened, what is happening, and what awaits us in the future, even if we are not really granted with the power to see into it. Now, Charlie, you were at the heart of the action, so to speak, at the MSC. Isn't that so hard to pronounce, right?
MSC? No, it isn't if you bounce off the M. MSC.
Okay, but you gotta admit it sounds a bit like a disease of some sort. It does sound like a disease. So you were there. I joined you later. Tell me what the vibes were like at the conference itself, because I think I'm too radioactive to ever be invited to these places.
Well, Kat, from a journalistic perspective, I had an incredible weekend. It was exhilarating, running around, talking to so many people, getting quotes, finding stories, making new contacts. But the vibes were far from immaculate, let's say. On the one hand, it felt more than slightly apocalyptic, especially after J.D. Vance's speech on day one. Lots of people were already worried about the US walking away from Europe and potentially selling out Ukraine in negotiations with Russia following US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's speech in Brussels a few days before the conference opened. And although he later walked back on some of those statements by saying that, some of the things they said were going to be on the table wouldn't necessarily be up for negotiation, and there were subsequent comments made by J.D. Vance and others by Trump, that lack of consistency about what messaging was coming out of Washington and whether one person would say one thing and the other would say the complete opposite, and what do you actually listen to? A lot of people were very worried about that. The other vibe, which was a bit more subtle and filtered out through various reports from people with better access to decision makers than I had, people like Shashank Joshi at The Economist, who wrote a fantastic wrap of the conference, but also a vibe that I noticed at a press conference I attended with the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, was that talks between the US and Europe about Ukraine were a lot more constructive than you might expect.
No way. Really?
That's what they said. But the thing is, both of those impressions can be true. You can absolutely have American officials and foreign policy experts who are sober and at least the kinds of people you feel like you could work with. But you can also have a man in the White House, the president, who has a track record of logging on to his own social media and throwing everything into disarray. Well, Kat, I can actually tell that you're desperate to jump in on this.
Yeah, she's seeing me claw the walls of the house, and devouring my pasta in frustration. I mean, look, I'm going to try to set aside my pro-Ukrainian bias because I think it's a bit obvious how I'm going to feel from the personal side of things, right? However, I think that there are some interesting observations that I kind of want to put forth. The biggest observation that I want to present is that I find it interesting to observe the way in which those who have supported Trump and also support Ukraine, like genuinely support Ukraine. Like they're pro-Ukrainian compared to being pro-Russian. They've argued so many times that Trump would be more effective to bring the war to an end on terms that would be favorable to Ukraine. They're now kind of in this struggle to attempt to explain away what has occurred in the last couple of days. And what I see is a confusion and loss. Some, you have like Senator Eric Schmidt, like, you know, you had a bunch of journalists kind of storming different senators. And Eric Schmidt, he comes out of, I'm assuming, like the Senate chamber. And he kind of expressed this, like, I don't know why Trump is doing this, but I believe he's a master negotiator.
Oh, doorstep interviews are always fascinating. I did a few of those at Munich, and because people don't expect them, you can do them without being rude. But because it's unexpected, you can often get some very revealing answers.
Yeah. And it was, I don't know if this was just the camera angle or what it was, but like, I don't know if he was even looking at the people interviewing him, but later, he was actually interviewed again on CNN, and he told Zelensky, kind of through this CNN journalist, not to lecture Trump, seemed to not understand why in the modern day and age, unlike the American Civil War, which is a counter-argument to try to bring up, why in the modern day and age, when you have missiles flying at incredible speeds, you can't hold elections, and again repeated the mantra that Trump was this amazing strategist.
It's fascinating how many people bring up that supposed counter-argument of America was able to host elections during the Second World War. Yeah, your territory was not under direct attack. Of course you could do that. And then they go to the Civil War, and they also give the example of the War of 1812. And Kat and I are both war studies students. And the character of those wars is very, very different to the war that we're currently seeing in Ukraine.
I don't think you even need to get historical about this. There were no hypersonic missiles in 1812. How are you going to hold elections with people on the front line, with people who have been displaced, with people who have been kidnapped and are held in Russian filtration camps? I do not understand.
And it's not just people being targeted in one part of the country, such as in the War of 1812. And that's before we even get to the fact that 20% of Ukraine is currently under Russian occupation.
Yeah, I mean, look, like going back to kind of like the coping mechanisms I'm noticing, another one of them.
Is that what I was noticing at Munich, copium, from the people saying?
I think it's all copium. There's different types of copium. You have the Europeans who are again saying, rise up. We need to rise up immediately now.
There were a lot of people who were saying the very decisive things. A lot of them, interestingly, were formerly very passionate transatlanticists. And now they were talking about Europe's need almost to go alone, essentially, after Washington looks like it could very well abandon them. But none of them actually backed up those statements with plans.
We'll get to yap about Europe in a second, but very quickly, I wanted to kind of point out the copium I saw with the United States. What I noticed is that another tactic they have is to constantly talk about how the previous American presidents failed to stop Putin. Bush with Georgia, Obama initially with Ukraine. Are they wrong? No, they're not. As was Trump, not incorrect to point out European dependency on Russian gas. But it's weird to bring up the repeated invasions by Russia of its neighbors and then defend a president who is hostile toward a victim of that invasion. It's like saying, I don't like murderers, but her skirt was too short, so oopsie daisy, he just couldn't hold himself back. She had nice long legs. Like, this is the line of logic that I am sensing from all of this. And I feel like you're not a master strategist when you abandon your ally, followed by behaving in such a way that European military company stocks are actually on the rise. There's also another camp, the last camp I really want to talk about. It's the folks who keep on saying that Trump is merely confused or is in this bubble of misinformation, as was claimed even by Zelensky. Now, unlike Zelensky, I'm not a diplomat. I'm not bound by diplomatic pleasantries. And probably shocking. And probably if I ever get into politics, by the time I will get into it, I'm going to be 60 and everyone we're talking about are going to be dead if the planet will even exist by that point. So
very optimistic to assume that we'll be making 60 at this rate.
Just have to say what needs to be said. Those people I know who thought that the nice words that they exchanged between themselves and these MAGA politicians meant something are now suddenly going through this shock therapy of realizing that their words probably meant nothing and that it was just that, pleasantries. And they're now in a dire need of an explanation as to why things are not working out. Mind you, and this really needs to be said, I admire the work of people I know who vote Republican and lean Republican,
Yes,
but
same.
have done their hardest to help Ukrainians. But much like my job search, not all the times you reach out, you will hear back. And as it stands to an average Ukrainian, the efforts of this pro-Ukrainian Republican lobbying camp, they failed. And I won't even get into the diaspora voting and how this sort of anti-Putin post-Soviet emigres who shilled for Trump are now having to find some defense for their shilling. But I'm curious to see whether there will be a way out for these people, because I would hate their effort to go to waste. And I feel like they have a higher chance of being listened to.
There was an interesting article by Tyler Cohen where he takes a look at the White House's strategy and says that it is obsessed by owning the libs, both as a means and as an end of the strategy. And then they flood the zone by firing out so many examples that it's overwhelming. And I mean, both of us, when we were preparing for this podcast, we were saying, when do we record it? We're recording this on Thursday night, but the news is changing so dramatically that, I mean, I haven't looked at my phone since we sat down to record this. Who knows what has come out within the past however many minutes. And this desire to just own the libs and almost celebrate cruelty is why they're coming out with things like ASMR videos of migrant deportations or immediately blaming diversity initiatives for the plane and helicopter collision over DC. And whether you think that every USAID project is money well spent or not, that's one thing. And it's certainly far from desirable that so many global health and civil society projects are propped up with US money, which, as we've seen, can be withdrawn at any moment. But what they're doing when people say, if you cut funding to anti-HIV programs in Africa, people are going to die in their millions, when you say that to them, they immediately go straight for the culture wars, something they know will get people's blood up and upset people. When that was brought up to Elon Musk, he just shrugged and said, some things I say will be wrong, as if that is a victory because you've made the libs upset by saying something that is demonstrably untrue.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not saying that reviewing where your funding goes is bad, right?
No,
obviously, if you pay taxes, you want to know. But Musk, who, you know, much like a lot of people around him, the yes men around him, who was supporting Ukraine at some point and now he supports Russia, he is now even cutting out community notes that existed. Yeah, free speech. So the one place that allowed the members of the public to fact check all of this information is now going to be removed.
All because he is upset that people were fact-checking Trump's claim that Zelensky has a 4% approval rate by showing a poll which actually shows it is a higher approval rating than Trump. And so Musk was saying that poll showing that Zelensky is more popular than the US president among their respective own people, that's clearly actually controlled by Zelensky in a kind of sinister, controlling the media kind of way. And that as a result, the community notes are being manipulated. So we're going to have to do something about that.
But you know what isn't controlled and manipulated? The very real screenshots in 4K that the reason likes were made private is because Musk was caught liking fetish porn. On this, I rest my case, but onto a more sexy topic. Charlie, go ahead and crush my soul more with even more chaotic news. You want to tell me something about the resources deal.
Yes, I'm going to crush your soul with a heavy document about heavy metals. So let's have a look at this now rather infamous resources deal. It was actually the Ukrainians, it may surprise you to learn, who raised the prospect to Washington that they would offer the US concessions to access its vast mineral reserves in return for security guarantees. The thinking was that they knew that Trump was so transactionally minded and so much of US foreign policy in recent years has been focused around strategic competition with China, which famously has enormous reserves of rare and valuable minerals, that they take it up. But the deal that was put on Zelensky's desk in Munich, which he refused, contained no such guarantees. It was all about paying Washington back for the money that they sent them, which isn't actually $350 billion, as Trump has claimed. It's $183 billion. And out of that, $58 billion was actually spent in the US itself on the domestic defense industry, paying skilled workers who are making kit to send to Ukraine and replace the old equipment that Washington donated.
Make it make sense. Just make it make sense, please, somehow, please.
That's something we ask ourselves every day as journalists. It's literally our job to make things make sense, and sometimes we just ask the ether to make things make sense. But Trump is not even content with recuperating that fictional $350 billion. He says the US is entitled to $500 million of Ukraine's natural resources. Now, I actually used to be a commodities journalist, so I can get a little bit geeky when it comes to this. Ukraine does have mineral reserves that are pretty unique in Europe, ranging from various rare earths to titanium, uranium, the list goes on. But there are several catches. Firstly, various sources put the percentage of these reserves that are currently in Russian-occupied territory between 20 and 70%. That uncertainty alone about how much there actually is and where it is should raise a lot of eyebrows. Secondly, you have the fact that the potential of a lot of these reserves is barely explored. We don't know what the quantity is, we don't always know what the quality is, and we don't even know how easy much of it is to get to. For example, Ukraine is thought to have 10% of the world's lithium deposits, so lithium being a critical component for high-capacity battery production, but none of that has been mined so far. And opening a new mine in Ukraine was difficult enough before the war, thanks to its rather infamous bureaucracy. Good luck doing that during a period of reconstruction, or if you've had to negotiate a deal with Russia to get access to reserves near Donetsk, for example. I mean, who knows? They actually might manage to negotiate that. But the deal goes even further than just bringing resources out of the ground. The Telegraph got hold of a copy of this deal, and their analysis suggests that the value of the reparations it demands in perpetuity under New York state law make up a greater portion of Ukraine's GDP than the conditions imposed against Germany in the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War. Now, the First World War was an absolute mess of countries declaring war against each other over various interests. But it's worth remembering that Germany was the aggressor that invaded Belgium, and that's what brought Britain into the war. And then they brought down the Lusitania on its way across the Atlantic, which is what got the US involved. Other stipulations in this deal include 50% of revenues from any mining licenses granted, or as well Ukraine's oil and gas reserves, and even from infrastructure such as ports. Effectively, this means that not only is Kyiv going to be worrying about reconstruction and whatever Russia is going to do next, but it's going to take up significant time and resources paying back America for money that has never been transferred without any guarantees that America will secure its future in the long term, which is especially critical because I don't know if Europe is going to be able to pull itself together in order to do that. If they do, it's going to take far too long. Keir Starmer, for example, has said that he is committed to raising Britain's defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. Now, bear in mind that various intelligence reports from Germany, for example, suggest that within 5 years, Russia will potentially have been able to rearm to such an extent that it can launch another attack. You'd think that countries would be acting with more urgency at the moment, but despite a lot of somewhat encouraging words that were said on the stages of the Munich Security Conference, people don't seem to be translating that urgency into action.
I remember on Ukraine the latest, about a year ago, I was listening to one of their guests who was saying that these types of behaviors, rapes of civilians, murders, executions of soldiers, it's systemic. And I'm concerned that in combination with Europe being slow and America now turning against Ukraine, we are accepting that this type of behavior is normal. Let's recall that Georgians have had the experience of having their heads decapitated and played with like a football in the 1990s. And nobody said anything about that. So a lot of concerns, but I decided to have a little chat with the guest for this week in order to see what is going on. Because what the fuck is going on is a very valid question that I have as it stands. And the someone like you, he understands economics and trade a little bit more than I do. It is Vladislav Inozemtsev. Inozemtsev is a Russian economist and political scientist, contributor to a variety of academic bodies, to the Center for Strategic and International Studies in D.C., and most importantly, also writes for the Moscow Times sometimes.
He does. He writes for our Russian service, and then I quite often translate some of his articles. He has some very interesting insight.
Yeah, so I decided to ask him a couple questions in order to bring forth these interesting insights. So on that note, here's our talk. Vladislav, thank you so much for coming. It is good to see an old friend face to face, even if separated by thousands of miles apart. How are you doing?
Fine. Everything is fine these days. Yeah.
So you're in Washington, D.C. We're across the sea from you. Stuff is not fine, as you may have seen in the news. So I'm hoping that your reassurance and your expertise could soothe my nerves before I reach for the valerianka in the kitchen drawer. I want to start with perhaps the dumbest, most obvious question. What the hell has just happened in the last week? What do you suspect Trump's plan to be? What is your general take on the situation?
It's very controversial. I wouldn't say I expect President Trump has some plan to implement. It looks like he embark on some chaotic actions, and I cannot see any kind of final goal. Yes, he reiterates every day that he wants to stop the killings, he wants to stop the war, the hostilities, but actually I cannot see any contours of something which can be called a plan. So he now actually, makes huge concessions to Putin without any reciprocal steps from the Russian side. No one knows what Russia proposes actually. And I would say this uncertainty will prevail till both presidents meet in person somewhere in maybe late February or most probably early March.
So some of the people have been saying that one of the reasons Trump has suddenly become so aggressive toward Zelensky had to do with the fact that he basically recognized that the Russian negotiators and in general the Russian government is a tough nut to crack, and pissed off by both kind of his lack of success of pushing through with whatever he wants with the Russians and with Zelensky not signing the minerals deal. He decided to have this rage fit. Would you say that that would be the case, or would you disagree with people proposing this idea?
I cannot actually say something concrete here, because the problem is, to my mind, that there is a long story of, I would say, not very happy relations between Trump and Zelensky, starting from the first term of Trump administration and actually with the last Zelensky's visit to the United States, when Trump said he was campaigning for Biden in Pennsylvania, and then it was a very harsh response from Trump's team when Trump didn't want to meet him in New York, but finally they met, and some disagreements also surfaced in December when Trump and Zelensky met in Paris. So I think the relationship hasn't been very good for a long time. But nevertheless, of course, I can say that Putin is very tough, and because of this, the relationship between Zelensky and Trump deteriorated, because, as it was said by many sources after the first meeting between Russian and American officials in Riyadh, there were actually no tough questions from the Russian side. The Russians were just mostly listening for what the Americans said. They wanted to discuss not so much the Ukrainian problem, They want to discuss the diplomatic relationship, the diplomatic property, and actually some economic issues, including the situation in the Arctic. So my point would be that there was no time to find out how big the differences between Putin and Trump really are. But even if this hadn't happened, even now the relations between Trump and Zelensky are in very bad shape. So it's a personal, as everything with Trump, it's personal affair between Trump and Zelensky, not so much between Trump and Putin.
In your piece for Gazeta Wyborcza, you predicted that Trump and Putin would eventually, once the two of them actually speak to one another, that they would eventually hit a wall in negotiations, that the talk would break down, leading to an escalation or a continuation of the status quo. Given the last few days, do you still stand by that prediction, or has something shifted? Because you seem to suggest that something is a little bit different. Because you did say, oh, well, it's very personal for him. So could there be a case that the two of them will figure it out because the big boys are talking?
Look, my point, and it was expressed even before Gazeta Wyborcza appeared, I have a very nice conversation with Stas Kuchar several days before, and my opinion, even from December, is the same. The war will not end this year. And so there are a lot of reasons for this, to my mind. So first of all, I just stick to this idea that Trump and Putin, as in 2017 and later, they will first engage in some constructive negotiations, and then Trump and mostly Trump's team will realize that the Americans are making a lot of concessions in exchange for nothing. Also, I do not trust Putin in any negotiations because Putin already had brought a lot of promises and a lot of treaties he personally signed. So therefore, I would say that on this front, so to say, it would be a lot of problems emerging between Trump and Putin. But there is definitely another front, which is Ukraine, and to some extent Europe. So in Ukrainian case, President Zelensky behaves himself quite tough. He didn't sign this natural resources contract, and I'm not commenting on whether he was right or not, but definitely it was, from the very beginning, it was a very strange deal because no one can expect who is even a little bit familiar with the issue. No one could expect Ukraine has rare earth metals in such degrees, in such quantities, that $500 billion can be even closely equal to this.
And I mean, not to mention that it's basically almost 3 times the amount of aid the United States gave to Ukraine. So I'm not sure if they're counting with percentages but it seems
agree,
like
but
quite a lot.
Everything here was very strange to hear, because $500 billion, if you apply this to the market of rare earths, you will see that this is around at least 80 years of the global production. So global production, not only Ukraine, which is really marginal. So anyway, I think that Trump will face opposition under very nice talks with Putin and a very open opposition with Zelensky. So I even can predict that he will just drop the attempts in several months, or he will be forced by the American elite, by the Congress, by the government to go further with American help to Ukraine. You know definitely that next week Mr. Starmer, Prime Minister of UK, and Mr. Macron, the French President, will arrive to Washington. So to persuade Trump actually to change his mind. We will see what happens. But anyway, I cannot imagine that where we are now, the conflict can be exhausted in this year.
But you mentioned that, the Americans are sort of realizing that they're making a lot of concessions and that all of this exchange is for nothing. But some of the arguments I've seen posed by people online who lean more toward this Duginist multipolarity type of, I can see you smiling because I'm smiling as well whenever I mention that rat. But some of them are saying, look, I mean, it only makes sense if, should America succeed in pressuring Ukraine, Russia and the United States could theoretically split Ukraine up for resources and get rid of the biggest thorn on their side, which is a Ukraine that actually asks for something. Would you call that sort of prediction BS, or is there credence to it?
No, I can trust in this because United States, they are not actually inclined to get some territorial advances at Ukraine's price and Ukraine's cost. The Europeans actually will definitely play much more important role in this game because Europe actually controls most of the Russian exports and imports. The European sanctions are most biting into the Russian economy. Europe, not the United States, controls the rest of the Russian assets, central bank assets. So anyway, I would say I cannot believe in kind of deal on Ukraine between US and Russia to get some territorial advances or some resources. Anyway, I would say that the most probable outcome will definitely include some territorial losses for Ukraine. But my point is that they shouldn't be final. And any kind of agreement which legitimizes Russian territorial advances is absolutely unacceptable, not only for the United States and not only for Ukraine, but for the whole world, because as I argued not long ago in my big article in the International Politik in Berlin, the problem is that no one international conflict or no one war between two recognized states, UN members, after 1945 hadn't resulted in redrawing of the borders. The status quo was restored anytime. Kyiv versus Argentina, Iran, Iraq in the 80s, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait in 1991, China and Vietnam. So in any of these cases, the borders were restored. So if the West agrees to cede to Russia these 4 Ukrainian regions plus Crimea, it would be the entire collapse of the rule-based international order which we all have been living in after 1945.
You basically beat me to my question, but there is still a follow-up to it because, as you pointed out, not just in German publications, but in Polish as well. Again, I'm referencing Gazeta Wyborcza because that's the article I've read. You put this emphasis on these international norms, and yes, they are important. I'm not advocating for it's a Geneva Convention, to preserve human rights. It's not a it's not a list of accomplishments, but we are dealing with 2 leaders, Trump and Putin, who are not necessarily your normal run-of-the-mill leader, right? Like, we're talking about Putin, who, for obvious reasons, functions like a mafioso, and Trump, who increasingly embraces monarchical imagery. So with these kind of players, will international norms withstand? I mean, you're pointing out the risk, but I'm concerned whether they will stand the test that is coming up.
It's a good question. I cannot answer this definitely because we should wait and see what happens. But once again, the problem with the Ukrainian conflict and with America's role in it is that America doesn't command Ukraine. And actually, no one can command Ukraine except the Ukrainians. And we just recently saw a surge in Zelensky approval ratings inside Ukraine, because his fellow citizens and even his political opponents, they see he is under siege and under pressure, and so therefore they will, gather around him and behind him. So therefore, my point is that Americans, they are actually losing their voice in these issues, and this is a big problem because Europe doesn't want to get hurt. I would say, Mr. Macron, to my mind, very correctly, to my mind, is not the best person to command the European Union on this case, because France is lagging behind even Denmark in providing support to Ukraine financially and militarily, and it is lagging 7 times behind Poland in humanitarian assistance, and foreign policy record for Macron is not very impressive. So I would prefer that either Berlin or Warsaw would lead the European Union efforts to consolidate the European position during these hard times with Trump. But nevertheless, so my point is that Kyiv and European capitals will definitely play a more important role in the coming developments than the US. The US just excludes itself while engaging with Putin. I don't know why Trump is doing this. I don't know what Putin expects him to do vis-a-vis Zelensky, but I think in Russia, in the Kremlin, the people do not realize completely the potential Americans now have to influence the conflict.
Yeah, I wanted to speak a little bit. I mean, I will slightly disagree on Trump's character. Not that I can vote in the United States, but that's a topic that you and I can discuss next time I'm in DC and we share a cup of coffee and have a heated debate. But I wanted to ask you about the Russian side. Unlike me, who was born there but left as a kid, you studied there, you lived there, you rubbed shoulders with a lot of people who formed or continue to kind of form part of the Russian political elite. So with this in mind, do you buy Kremlin's enthusiasm? Have they actually outplayed Washington so far, or is there a deeper game at play, something we might be missing?
First of all, I would say that the Russians are definitely quite optimistic. Most of it political elite. Moreover, I would say the market dynamics in the Russian economy during the recent 10 days also shows two very important things for me. Because on the one hand, it says that it proves that the Russian business wants peace, not war. And all the ideas that the war-like economy, the wartime economy is benefiting the Russians and the Russian elite, it looks to be not very much grounded. So therefore, we have all seen the rise in stock indexes, the appreciation of the ruble. So economy is preparing for something to happen on the road to peace. The Russian elite, political elite, is also very enthusiastic because it feels that something is in the air. Trump is ours. We can control the United States. We can do business with them together. But what is most crucial for me is that the most realistically minded people in Moscow, like economic bloc of the government, like Mrs. Nabiullina, like Mr. Silovanov, they're very cautious. And just earlier today, Ms. Nabiullina released a comment on the Russian economy, saying that it's very much premature to include the perspectives for peace or for negotiations inside the macroeconomic forecast for 2025. She also said that some comments by Russian officials that Western companies, including MasterCard and Visa, can return also don't have any practical grounds for this, so it's just wishful thinking. And I think these people are quite true. So investors, they are showing their enthusiasm for peace. The elite is showing their enthusiasm for making deals with Trump. In the middle, there is not so much uncertainty, but skepticism.
Speaking of economics, I wanted to ask about sanctions and international companies. Now, I'm terrible at counting. 2 + 2 = 10 in my mind. So I'll leave you to do the hard math. But one of the point of sanctions and all of these international companies leaving Russia was to kind of demonstrate to an average consumer and to the government that, when you play bad, there are certain privileges taken away. You can't kill civilians and continue to buy Gucci bags. But what does it mean if you already have companies, before any official peace is even announced, especially if there are concerns that with the way the Russian economy is overheated, it's only a matter of time before Putin will relaunch some sort of an invasion, considering just how much effort has been put into put Russia on sort of war economy rails?
Look, I would say there are two different questions here in one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Sanctions are concerned. I completely agree that they should stay in place. Even quite a while after the conflict is finalized, if it will be. And I haven't seen any attempts from the European from the European side to lift the sanctions. So they are in place, they will be in place, and it will last for long. Actually, in any circumstances, to lift a set of sanctions is a much harder task than to impose them. Everyone knows this. So here I have no much doubts. What about the companies? The companies are absolutely free to choose their own strategy. Yes, there was a lot of emotions in the first days of the war when they went out. For example, MasterCard and Visa and major international airlines and strategic company which were engaged in machine building in Russia and many other issues like automobile industry. They didn't left by themselves. It were the sanctions which actually force them to leave. So if the sanctions are lifted, we can expect them to come back. All the issues like Gucci and other fashion brands and companies which produce, for example, foodstuff, most of them are still active in Russia. So yes, once again, there is a sanction regime which prohibits the companies to sell luxury goods to the Russian consumers everywhere in the world. It's once again sanctions. So I can expect that some mid-sized companies, they can return. And this is their own choice. We can condemn them for this, but this process is hardly can be stopped. Moreover, I would say many, even huge companies, still remain in Russia, like French retailers like Auchan and Leroy Merlin. They're still there. Patrick Pouyanné of Total Energy just recently said that Total accumulated, just imagine, $2 billion euros in dividends from a Russian project last year. 2 billion euros earned in Russia is half of the French military assistance to Ukraine from the start of the war. So therefore, they are still there, maybe under some restrictions imposed by the Russians, mostly, not by the Europeans. Anyway, a corporate question is a moral dilemma, and the sanctions are the sanctions, and we should distinguish between them quite clearly.
We slightly touched on this, but still, if the U.S. scales back its support for Ukraine, or if, it doesn't, but nonetheless some sort of a peace is achieved, what message will that send to Moscow? Will Putin see it as a green light for further territorial ambitions in the future once he can, somewhat recover the economy, somewhat recover the army? Or, will he decide, okay, enough was enough, I secured my place in the history books and hold back?
Look, to my mind, if the United States sees this to help Ukraine, I think the Europeans have quite enough resources to continue. The Ukrainians are ready to fight, and I think they seemingly are. So in this case, the Europeans should adjust their strategy. In this case, they have close to no alternative for seizing and confiscating or using as a collateral the Russian assets blocked in Europe, and to use these 300 billion euros or dollars for buying weapons for Ukraine, either from European producers or abroad, because there is a global market for weaponry, for ammunition. You can buy it from many suppliers. Anyway, if we talk about Putin, I would expect that he will never stop in trying to annihilate Ukraine. Just today, I had a big interview published in Rzeczpospolita in Warsaw, and it starts with a statement that a Ukrainian question for Putin is like a Jewish question for Hitler, and this is absolutely the same psycho against these issues, and he will never stop. He will either die trying to do this, or he will succeed, or he will be defeated. But Ukraine for him is, the most important question in his life and his worldview of today. I really doubt that he will try to cross the border with any NATO country, and this is why the question of NATO membership for Ukraine is so important for him. But yes, he will not stop in his aggressive policies till he's alive. He's not a major existential threat to Europe, and of course to the United States, but for Ukraine, he definitely is.
Well, let's hope he kicks the bucket sooner than later, so we can maybe enjoy some other presidency of Russia and maybe more normal one. Vladislav, thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see you here soon enough.
Yeah, it's a pleasure of mine. Thank you so much.
So that was Vladislav. Obviously, a lot to think about, and it seems like the smart older men are a bit confused and uncertain. I'm not saying that in a bad way. Me too, in times like these.
Is it comforting to know they are also confused and uncertain, or is it more worrying?
I feel like I'm going to plead the fifth on this question. Honestly, I don't know if plead the fifth exists in the UK, but I'm pleading the fifth.
We're told when we're arrested, I say that like I've been arrested before. I haven't. What is it?
You have the right to remain silent.
Anything we say could be used as evidence against us in the court of law.
So I'm practicing my right to remain silent. Instead, I will bring the mic back to you because you have some news about, oh God, I can't believe we're mentioning on this podcast, the Tate brothers, and Romania itself.
Well, I promise we won't usually talk this much about the US on this podcast, but unfortunately, a lot of things seem to be linked at the moment. There are two stories that I want to bring up quickly. The first is that US officials have told the Romanian government to give Andrew and Tristan Tate their passports back. They are dual UK-US citizens. They are also both self-described misogynist influencers, so I can call them that without risk of being sued. The brothers, as well as two Romanian women, are awaiting trial for charges of rape, human trafficking, and engaging in organised criminal activity, all of which they have denied. Last August, local officials even said they were investigating allegations that the men had trafficked and had sex with a minor. Romania's foreign minister said that though Richard Grenell, Trump's envoy, had raised the issue with him at Munich, he didn't put pressure on him, as has been reported. But the timing of this is all very interesting.
I'm glad that, while Financial Times comes out with documentaries about Ukrainian soldiers getting executed, the priorities of the U.S. administration are in the right place? Like, what am I supposed to say to this? I'm sorry.
Well, it's certainly in the right place in some sense of the word. This isn't the only way Bucharest has come into Washington's crosshairs over the past few days. You may remember that in Vice President J.D. Vance's speech at Munich, which went down like a bucket of cold sick, by the way, I was in the building just as people were leaving the hall, and the general mood was that it was a bit rich for the Vice President of a man impeached for inciting an insurrection to lecture them about democracy. So, during his speech, he only mentioned Ukraine twice in his entire speech. He spent most of it claiming that Europe had abandoned European values and freedom of speech and democratic freedom. And he criticised Romania for annulling the result of its election last year. This was as part of a larger spiel he did, calling things disinformation or misinformation and propaganda is an attack on free speech and is highly politicised, whereas we actually know that state-backed disinformation is a serious security threat to Europe. So, what happened in Romania? Why did they annul their election last year?
TikTok happened, right?
TikTok.
Yay! I got the answer right. Oh my God.
Yeah, so Romania's constitutional court ruled that Russia had coordinated a large-scale TikTok campaign that saw pro-Kremlin and anti-NATO outsider Călin Georgescu surge in the polls, and this guy surged. Now, there are some very interesting and slightly ironic details in this story. An investigation by the fantastically named Snoop outlet, after the election was ordered to be rerun, found that the offending TikTok campaign was actually paid for by the Liberal Party, who were the junior partners in the governing coalition. They commissioned an agency to hire 130 apolitical influencers, the kind of people who talk about gaming or makeup, to talk about the Liberal candidate under the hashtag balanced and seriousness. But the campaign got hijacked and they ended up talking about Georgescu instead. Snoop got hold of the scripts these influencers were sent, and I'm going to read out some excerpts because I think they're a great example of how to recognize coordinated messaging in information campaigns. These influencers were given this line: "There are 14 presidential candidates, but not all of them are equally experienced or equally prepared for the office of president." Influencer 5 said, "As you know, there are 14 candidates. But obviously, not all of them are ready to become the president of Romania." Influencer 7 said, "We have 14 candidates, but are they all ready for the position of president?"
Holy shit, this is like reminding me of all of these clips of Russian TikTok influencers who are repeating word for word scripts of trying to justify the so-called special military operation.
Exactly. Or another example, "We want a serious and balanced president." Influencer 2, "The most important thing, ... is to be a balanced person." Influencer 3, "I think we all want a fair, serious and balanced man." You get the idea. And then at the same time that all of this was going on, Romanian intelligence services identified over 25,000 dormant TikTok accounts that suddenly became active just before the election, which is indicative of a potential information campaign.
But, okay, 25,000 accounts, but how do you know they had any actual influence?
Well, it isn't straightforward. I did a training program about information warfare with the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Lab, DFR Lab, where we looked at how to assess this kind of thing. And we concluded that it's actually very difficult to prove cause and effect. Let's say you have 25,000 accounts producing more or less identical propaganda, the kind of thing that I just gave you an example of. That doesn't mean that many people are going to see it. Lots of those impressions are not going to be organic, and large numbers probably just mean there's some poor sod chained to his desk at an office in St. Petersburg who is juicing their numbers to appease their boss who wants to see results. Then there's the question of who is seeing this propaganda. Generally, social media algorithms show you the kind of content you want to see.
I did not ask for unsolicited boobies, OnlyFans girls, or straight up Nazism on my feed, though.
Yeah, neither did I. But even then, for every person that scares away, there will be people who keep scrolling down the app because they're angry. They still get hooked. But it's still generally the case that people who see this kind of propaganda are the people who are already most susceptible to it. And then you have to consider that elections are fought on a range of issues, and that makes it even harder to prove that a campaign has cut through. In the case of Romania, Georgescu won 22.9% of the vote in the first round, when pre-election projections taken just before the campaign started put him in single figures. That's astonishing in such a small amount of time and could indicate that there is something going on. And this is all particularly important because Romania is an especially crucial part of the NATO alliance. Just look at its location on a map. It's a staging ground for monitoring the Black Sea, famously a haunt of Russian warships, both above and below the water. It's the interception point for lots of the air traffic coming between Europe and the Middle East and all the signal intelligence you'd expect to come along with that. And it also hosts the NATO Aegis anti-missile system. The rerun election isn't due to take place until May. But if comments from Musk and Vance, who met with the far-right Alternative für Deutschland instead of German Chancellor Olaf Scholz when he was in Munich, if those are anything to go by, we could see far-right candidates who are more sympathetic to Russia and less willing to take part in international security rise to power at a time when Europe is especially vulnerable and trying to get its act together.
What scares me about coming out of this week is that I'm not coming out with the secure part of a security conference. I'm coming out genuinely asking, how is it possible that a country I was born in, along with the country that gave me my education, are both hostile in different ways toward a country my parent is from and where I lived for the past couple of years until the full-scale invasion. The message is quite clear as to where it's going. And for many people, it's not going anywhere really good. And I really do hope that the videos of how mercilessly lives are sniffed away by a bunch of people who go and kill for money, not out of a sense of patriotism. Majority of Russian soldiers are contractors, not conscripts. That all of these brutal videos with no things blurred out will be shown on repeat to some people who make the important decisions. Because I feel like they've seen these videos, but I think they've not seen them enough, because none of this is going to stop. Inozemtsev said so. Other experts we spoke with said so. When you have a state which for decades has been teaching its public and is teaching its children to hate you, I don't understand what kind of feasible peace you can muster up that's actually going to be long-term. We're not talking about Nazi Germany here, where it gets splintered up and its public re-educated.
One of the most striking things I was a part of at the Munich Security Conference was the annual Ukrainian lunch. Now, I wasn't actually in the room having food served to me. There was a foyer outside where there were lots of journalists and people from various delegations gathered.
You could have just sneaked in. You could have sneaked in to have a little bite.
The door was closed, but they did provide some food outside, and actually there were lots of very, very interesting people to talk to. And they had on a big screen where they were showing the speakers who were addressing the people who were eating, and one of them was Trump's special envoy to Russia and Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg. And that was where he said explicitly that Europe and Ukraine would not be at the negotiating table with Russia and the United States. And that was met with horror by the various political, military, media, diplomatic figures I was standing with outside. Throughout the various conversations I was having, I think some people were trying to laugh through the horror as a coping mechanism, but you could really overhear conversations from the Ukrainians in the room who have been staring their own destruction in the face for years, and now it's potentially come into even sharper relief. I asked the Finnish president a couple of hours later about whether Europe had missed an opportunity through some of their decisions in recent months to have that, and he said that he had spoken to General Kellogg the day before, and that he hadn't said anything of the sort to him. So Kellogg's comments at this lunch were the first he'd heard.
Well, that's a switch up. Wow.
Exactly. I think that's quite a remarkable demonstration of the inconsistency that we've been faced with and how confusing that is, and how arguably that uncertainty it's another card in Russia's hands.
Tomorrow is another day, and maybe hope that tomorrow we will wake up to news that are a bit more merciful to us. Well, on this sort of depressing note, you can't even make this up, but as we're recording this conclusion, an air raid alert comes through. I should actually check what is flying.
Whilst you do that, I should clarify that it's Lieutenant General Kellogg rather than General. You should always be precise with people's rank.
As a war studies student, you know.
Or Lieutenant General, as he'd probably say, because Americans are so literal with their pronunciation.
Well, on this note, I think we'll probably wrap up and apologize that the episode going out this week is by no means happy and cheerful with as many jokes, not only because I sound like a chain smoker, but because I don't really know whether to be happy that the faces of the people I know could be blown to smithereens and it will not even matter.
Last night, I was discussing this news with a friend of mine. This was after Trump posted his screed against Zelensky, and he described it as worst-case scenario, to which I responded, no, it can always get worse.
Yeah, when you fall to the floor, remember there can sometimes be a basement. So on that note, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for joining us for yet another episode of All Out on the Eastern Front. Join us next week at 6 p.m. London time, either on Spotify or YouTube, hopefully with some happier news. If you like what we do, the software we use and the food for our cats won't pay for themselves, so a link to our Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee pages will be provided in the show notes below.
You can get in touch with us via Twitter. I'm Hancock2001, and Kat is at Ishinhelia. If you can't spell her last name, don't worry. The links to our social media accounts will be available in the show notes below. And see you next week.